Hello, Mr. Pylan's U.S. History class. This will be your first flipped video in this class. A flipped video, for those of you who may not have had teachers that did this in the past, is a video that you're supposed to watch outside of class to be prepared for either a conversation in class or an activity that we're doing. So this is preparation for you. It's going to look a lot like the video that we did in class before. It is a PowerPoint presentation, and I'm going to talk and give you the bullet points as well as extra information on the PowerPoint presentation. And again, you're going to have a note guide that's very similar to the one we did before in class for the first PowerPoint that you did. So you should do something very similar that we did in class. You should listen to my words, you should listen to what I'm talking about, and you should take notes and try to answer the questions and the prompts that are on the note guide. I'm going to talk about some of the bullet points in each slide, but I'm also going to talk about the general history of it all and reasons why the U.S. got involved. I'll say things that aren't on the slides, so you should take notes on those things as well. As usual, one of the things you should do in the slideshow and in a flipped video is realize, first of all, that I'm going to talk kind of fast at times. I might give some good information, and I might give some good information on top of other information that you're trying to write down. Don't be afraid to, and of course I always recommend that you stop the video. Stop the video, collect your thoughts, take your notes, and then move on and resume the video. I'll try not to talk too long, but again, the things that I have to say are going to be in your quizzes and tests, so you're going to want to take as good of notes as possible. What else do you need to know about this flip video? We're also going to try to do the 10-2-2 documented thinking or note-taking activity that we did before. Take notes for about 10 minutes, and then I'll remind you when 10 minutes is up, and then for 2 minutes you should review your notes, and for another 2 minutes you should add to your notes or question your notes or write an anecdote to your notes that you have, and then resume the video after that. It's called a 10-2-2. Studies show that students who take notes will remember something for a little while, but students who take notes and then actually look at their notes later and review their notes will remember the information for much longer. So that's what we're trying to do. All right, without further ado, this is why the U.S. joined World War I. Why did we get involved? Remember, the learning objective, the first learning objective for the unit that we're studying, War and Diplomacy, is why did the U.S. get involved in foreign affairs? This foreign affair was World War I. Also known as the Great War, or the war to end all wars when it first started. Let's start. Alright, general overview. World War I happened from 1914 to 1918 in Europe. Most of the fighting actually happened in France because Germany declared war on France and attacked France before France really knew that they were doing it. So by the time they got their military ready, the Germans had already invaded a lot of the French countryside, and they couldn't get them back into Germany. So a lot of the fighting and destruction took place in France, which caused a lot of devastation for France itself. The causes of World War I in Europe are militarism, alliances, imperialism, and nationalism. And make notes about these. We're going to concentrate on why the U.S. got involved, but you still need to know the main causes of World War I. So if you can remember the acronym MAIN, M-A-I-N, you can remember the causes of World War I. M stands for militarism. When all of those countries in the late 1700s became countries that were involved in industrial production, all of those countries were able to develop bombs, guns, planes, tanks, things like that. And when they were able to do that, they were able to build up their military. That's what militarism is. It's the building up of the military. So by the time World War I started, all of these countries had incredibly strong, powerful militaries. So when the war did start, it caused incredible amounts of devastation. Alliances. When the countries started building up their militaries, they also realized that if something did go wrong, there was going to be a lot of damage and destruction. So what happens is, secretly and sometimes publicly, these countries started developing alliances with each other. In other words, hey, if something goes wrong, will you be on our side and help us fight against this side in case something does go wrong? So alliances developed. Austria-Hungary, which was an empire inside of Europe, developed an alliance with Germany. And then they brought in Turkey, and for a brief while they brought in Italy. And they said that if anything goes wrong, we will all stand together. When the other countries heard about this, they developed an alliance of their own. France, England, and Russia developed an alliance called the Allied Powers. The other countries were known as the Central Powers. And of course, when things went wrong, which we all know they did, those two sides faced off against each other. It was Germany and Austria-Hungary doing most of the fighting on the Central Powers, and it was France, England, and Russia fighting for the Allied Powers. And eventually the United States joins the Allied Powers and fought against Germany. Imperialism is the third cause of World War I. What happened is all of those countries were very powerful. They had navies and ships, and so they actually started going out into the rest of the world and developing their empires. They started taking over smaller countries, territories like Africa and the Philippines and Southeast Asia and China. They all started to develop these empires, and eventually they all started to feel like they needed to build the biggest empire possible in order to compete with each other. Germany wanted an empire, England wanted a large empire, France wanted a large empire. So they started to actually compete with each other on who could have the most power throughout the world. Last but not least, at this time in history, there developed something called nationalism. What nationalism is a belief that your nation is the strongest nation and best nation, and your people are the best people in the world. You have this really sense of not just European pride, but like German pride. German nation is the best. Or English pride. The England nation is the best. Or Austro-Hungarian Empire, that your nation is above all others. And France. And then so you start to get this feeling that these countries are all developing this really strong sense of nationalism, which means that eventually they all were going to start competing with each other to see who the best was. And what better way to compete with each other than start a war and see who wins? And sure enough, they did, and millions of people suffered because of it. All right. So, like I said, the United States was able to stay out of the war for a long time, until 1917. But between 1914 and 1917, America was able to maintain neutrality. They stayed neutral. In other words, they stayed out of it. Woodrow Wilson, the guy who's in the lower right-hand corner, was the president at the time, and he was very much for the neutral thing. He didn't want to get involved with the war. He knew it was going to be very devastating, and lots of people were getting killed because of it. They thought it was a European problem. They said, you know what, let Europe fight it out. They'll figure it out eventually. Unfortunately, as the war started going from 1914 to 1915 to 1916 to 1917, it became very, very hard to stay out of the war for the United States. They knew that eventually, if the fighting didn't stop, they would probably have to intervene at some point. And eventually, they did. But because of different reasons. And we're going to get into those reasons here in just a second. Okay, so what was one of the main reasons? Submarine warfare was something that pulled the United States into the war. You've probably heard of the sinking of the Lusitania. It happened because there were a very deadly force in Germany at the time. The force was undersea boats in Germany called U-boats. They were submarines. The Germans had submarines, and they used them during the war to sink ships that belonged to the Allied powers' navy, and they were very successful at this. While they were doing this, unfortunately, also, the United States was still engaged in travel back and forth to Europe. I know you find this hard to believe, but people during this time still did things like hop on boats and travel across the Atlantic and go all the way to England in order to visit family members and things like that. most people thought it was a pretty safe thing to do. Unfortunately, the United States was also at this time lending a lot of what we call military goods to the Allied powers. They were shipping ammunition, guns, tanks, jeeps over to England, and England was buying these things from the United States in order to help fight the war. So at the time, the German army found out that the United States was doing this, and so they told the United States, or warned the United States, that the ships that were shipping these things were going to get shot down as well if they found them. And so the United States largely ignored Germany's warnings until eventually what happened was a passenger ship called the Lusitania, which was a huge ship. It was like the Titanic, which had thousands of people on board, was going to England, and it was sunk by a German U-boat. This was one of the things that brought us into the war. It wasn't the last straw, but it was definitely, we knew at this point that we were getting close to war. It was a British ship, and it was carrying 128 American passengers, and the United States was very upset. Many people in the United States were very upset about the loss of that ship. And of course, we blamed Germany, who of course was responsible for the attack, and we wanted to do something about that. So then, that was one thing. Believe it or not, even after the Lusitania, America remained somewhat neutral still. There was more to come that would bring us into the war. All right, U.S. history students, that is actually about 10 minutes of notes thus far. So what you should do at this point is take a 2-minute break, pause the video, and then look at your notes and review them. Add to your notes, and even go back to different slides and listen to my recording if you missed something. Take about 4 minutes, take that break, and make sure you're answering the prompts on the note guide that was provided. Because of the sinking of the Lusitania, many people in the United States started to demonize the Germans and blame them for the start of World War I, or the Great War. A lot of anti-German feelings became more and more common in the United States. So eventually it became very clear that if the United States was to enter the war, they were probably going to enter on the side of the Allies, seeing as how the Germans sank a ship of 126 innocent civilians. Even though the Germans warned the United States, do not ship any ships across the Atlantic anymore, they still did, and they got sank, and so Germans became very unpopular in the United States. So a lot of propaganda, which is just advertisements essentially, and sentiment and feelings became more popular against the Germans. In the lower left-hand corner, you see a very popular poster that you would have seen at the time: defeat the Kaiser and his U-boats. The Kaiser was the guy in charge of Germany. Victory depends on which fails first, food or frightfulness, and that is a picture in the background of a German U-boat overlooking the sinking of a Lusitania. And of course, you notice that the look of the German Kaiser in the front of the picture is very demonic. They make him look very nasty. So you start to see this anti-German sentiment. In the middle, you have a hamburger. Now, for those of you who don't know, the reason a hamburger is called a hamburger is because it was invented in Hamburg, Germany. And so people started calling a hamburger a liberty sandwich instead of a hamburger, because they didn't want to acknowledge that it actually came from Germany. And over on the right-hand side is sauerkraut, something that a lot of people eat and a lot of people use very commonly. But since it's from Germany, people started changing the name of it. They called it Liberty cabbage. So what you see is like an overall American effort to deny Germans proper respect in the United States. And so we started to feel like Germany was the enemy. And we started to talk about that and advertise that and create that sentiment. The allies in this case are Norway, the allies in this are France, Russia, Great Britain, and later on the US. So if you notice from the map, Russia's on the right over here. France is on the left over here. Italy actually joined the Allies, and then England over here. The problem, as you'll see later, is that the other side, or the Central Powers, Germany, Austria-Hungary, Italy, and the Ottoman Empire. Italy later joins the Allies, but at first they were part of this. Germany, Austria-Hungary, and the Turkish Empire, but the Turks are way over here. The problem that they have is that, unfortunately for them, they're in the dead center of Europe. So they are actually, unfortunately, surrounded on all sides when the war began, which means that in order to defend themselves properly, Germany and Austria-Hungary have to send some soldiers over to this side to fight Russia, and they have to send the rest of their soldiers over to this side to fight this area of the world. And that is hard to do. What you really don't want to do if you're the leader of an army is to separate your army. You're always going to be much stronger when it's together. So they were already fighting a war that was very hard to fight for them to begin with. And they have England, France, Italy, and Russia surrounding them. And later on, they actually have the United States joining in that effort. So then they're even more overwhelmed by that. They're bound to lose. The other thing that that got the United States into the war was money. The United States had lent money to both Great Britain and Germany to fund their wars. Anytime you fight a war as a country, you need money. You have to pay for things like your soldiers. You have to pay your soldiers. You have to pay for tanks, guns, ammunition. You have to pay the people in your country that are making those things. So it takes a lot of money to fight a war. Well, the United States was lending money to both sides in order for them to fight that war. And that's okay. A lot of countries do that during wartime. They don't take part in the war, but they actually fund the war for other countries. It actually, in the United States, for the United States perspective, can be very financially beneficial. In other words, if you fund the war, the winning side of the war owes you money at the end of it, and usually they pay you back plus interest. They pay you back more than you lent them to begin with. So you stand the chance to gain a lot of money from funding one of the sides. Here's the problem though. United States has to fund the right side. Here's what happens. If you fund Germany and let's say Germany loses the war, well, Germany can't pay you back because they lost the war. They don't have the ability to pay you back. So it becomes very important to pick the winning side. And if you can follow the money, take a look at the graph right here. The United States loans Great Britain $2 billion for the war. They only loan Germany $27 million for the war. So when it all comes down to it, who does the United States need to win this war so they can get paid back? That's right. They want Great Britain to win this war because $2 billion is a lot of money, and they need Great Britain to pay that money back. So the losing side would most likely not have been able to pay their debt. Which side would the U.S. want to get back more? Yes, Great Britain. So when push comes to shove and the United States needs to make sure that their money comes back to them, what side do you think they're going to join? That's right. Once again, the side that they lent $2 billion to. That's what's going to happen. And that's what they did. Last but not least, the final straw, guys. Everybody's heard of this one, or maybe you forgot about this one. You probably learned about it in middle school. The Zimmerman Note, or the Zimmerman Telegram. At this time in history, most of the communications going on both sides, the Central Powers and the Allied Powers, were in code. In other words, it was a secret coded message because everybody needed to be secretive about what they were doing. If the other side of the Allied Powers found out what telegrams you were sending, or if the Central Powers found out what telegrams the Allied Powers were sending, they could potentially win the war by spying on them or getting their secrets. So all these telegrams were in code. One of the telegrams that were sent by the foreign minister, the German Prime Minister Zimmerman, was called the Zimmerman Note. In 1917, January 16th, the British actually intercepted. In other words, they recovered a coded telegram sent by Zimmerman to a Mexican ambassador. He actually sent the telegram to Mexico. The British called the United States, and the British said, hey, we got something. It came from the German Prime Minister, and he's sending it to Mexico. Well, you'll never guess what the telegram said. Before I tell you what it said, try to answer these questions as I read the text. Do you think the United States should enter the war at this point? Why do you think so? What suggestion would you give to the President Wilson if you were one of his advisors? Okay. The Zimmerman note said to the Mexican ambassador, we intend to begin on the 1st of February unrestricted submarine warfare. We shall endeavor, in spite of this, to keep the United States of America neutral. In the event of this not succeeding, we make Mexico a proposal of alliance on the following basis. Make war together, make peace together, generous financial support, and an understanding on our part that Mexico is to reconquer the lost territory in Texas, New Mexico, and Arizona. The settlement in detail is left to you. You will inform the President of the above most secretly as soon as the outbreak of war with the United States of America is certain, and add the suggestion that he should, on his own initiative, invite Japan to immediate adherence and at the same time mediate between Japan and ourselves. Please call the President's attention to the fact that the ruthless employment of our submarines now offers the prospect of compelling England in a few months to make peace. Signed, Zimmerman. In other words, Zimmerman told Mexico that if they attack the United States, they will ally with Mexico. Germany is saying that they can win the war over in Europe, and if you conquer the United States and attack them and get Japan to help you out, we can all be in this together, and you can take back all the territory in the United States that you lost during the Mexican-American War. So that was the Zimmerman telegram. The question is whether or not the United States was to believe that this was a real telegram, or was it actually just England trying to give a fake telegram to the United States in order to entice them to enter the war on England's side. So they had to be very careful. So what they did is they actually asked Zimmerman himself, the German foreign minister, the German prime minister, did you send this telegram? Well, anybody who's smart would know that the German prime minister should have probably just said, no, I never sent a telegram. Instead, unbelievably, Zimmerman said, yeah, I sent the telegram to Mexico. So the United States was kind of dumbfounded by his admission of this, and that got them that much closer to war, and probably were now leaning towards going to war against Germany on the side of England. What else got us into the war? Unrestricted submarine warfare. In the Zimmerman note, it said that the Germans were going to start unrestricted submarine warfare. In other words, if they see a ship in the Atlantic Ocean anywhere near them, they are going to destroy it with their submarines. No questions asked, no boarding the ships. They're just going to torpedo everything they see and sink it. So between February and March of that year, 1917, 6 U.S. ships were actually sunk. American citizens called for U.S. to declare war after this because everybody who had been fed up with all of the information coming about the Germans, the warfare, the Zimmerman note, it was all piling up. And of course, people remembered the Lusitania as well. So that was that. With all those things adding up, finally, President Wilson asked Congress to declare war against Germany. He made a very good argument in Congress, took about 6 days, and declared war, so that the United States was officially part of World War I, or the Great War, or the war to end all wars. And we were able to, shortly thereafter, claim victory over the Central Powers on November 11th. And that is why we celebrate Veterans Day on November 11th, because on the 11th hour of the 11th day, of the 11th month, all was quiet on the Western Front because the ceasefire and the surrender was finally made, it finally happened, and the fighting ended. So that's the main reasons why, first and foremost, that Europe went to war in 1914. But again, remember to look over your notes and concentrate on the learning objective. The learning objective is, why did the U.S. get involved in the war? We know why Europe went to war. M-A-I-N, Maine. Militarisms, alliances, imperialism, and nationalism. But the main thing that you need to worry about with your notes is, why did the U.S. get involved in the war? So go back and make sure you review your notes. And thanks again. And this is your first flip video, and I hope you guys enjoyed it. And I'll see you in class. Thanks again, guys. Bye.